London records never mention them, church archives deny they ever existed, and yet, in the quiet, rotting corners of abandoned libraries there are whispers. Whispers of men who stitched their mouths shut with black thread, not from madness, but from loyalty. They called themselves the Silent Brothers of Black Hollow. Picture it. The year is 1712. Deep within the wooded heart of Eastern Europe, a monastery stands, half buried in fog, its bells long rusted silent. Inside, a procession of hooded men moves like shadows, each robe marked with an emblem, a hollow circle, split by a vertical line, a symbol never catalogued in any religious order. Their faces pale, eyes sunken, mouths bound tight. They do not speak, not because they cannot, but because they must not. What oath demanded such silence? What knowledge was so dangerous that to utter even a syllable was to risk the world unraveling? A single witness, a wayward traveller who claimed to have stumbled upon their gathering, described the sound of chains dragging along the chapel floor. And then a voice, not human, but vast, like the groan of the earth itself, speaking from beneath the altar. The brothers listened, motionless, trembling but obedient. The traveller swore it was no priest, no man, but something older, something buried. And then he disappeared. His letter remains, sealed in wax, found hidden in a collection of condemned manuscripts. The ink is faded, the words scratched in haste, but one line never fails to chill the blood. They do not worship God, they serve the hollow. The question is not whether this order existed. The question is why every trace of them was erased, why their symbols were burned from records, why their monastery was swallowed in fire, why history insists they were never there. But history lies. And tonight I will take you where history dares not go, into the marrow of Black Hollow, into the brotherhood that tore out tongues, sealed lips, and carried secrets no man was ever meant to carry. Once you step inside, you will not leave unchanged. The Silent Brothers did not emerge from nowhere. They were the residue of something far older, a shadow lineage that predated Christianity itself. Before they were monks, they were keepers of a code that stretched back to Babylon, where men whispered to stone idols and swore vows not of faith, but of silence. Silence was not just a discipline, it was a weapon. To remain mute was to preserve power, to seal truth away from the uninitiated. Black Hollow was their final incarnation, their last fortress before they were erased. And it is said that within those stone walls, beneath the cracked frescoes of saints, lay a chamber with no doors, no windows, only a pit. A pit lined with bones, where voices rose not from throats, but from the earth itself. This was their scripture, not parchment, not ink, but sound that seeped upward, old as soil. The Church, of course, could not allow this. For centuries, Rome had waged a war not only against heresy, but against memory itself. They didn't just burn pagan texts, they buried entire orders of men who carried knowledge outside of its control. The Silent Brothers were not a rival religion, they were a threat to the monopoly of truth. Witness accounts, smuggled into coded journals, spoke of strange rituals, the brothers kneeling in circles, heads bowed, their mouths bleeding from the stitches, as if the silence itself demanded a sacrifice. At the center of their rites, always, that sigil, the hollow circle cut by a single line. It meant the gap, the wound between worlds. And here lies the question that gnaws at the bones of history. Were they lunatics? Or had they discovered something the world was never meant to hear, something buried, not in heaven, not in scripture, but in the hollow spaces beneath creation itself? Those who sought to expose them often vanished. One priest, Father André, was dispatched in 1715 to Black Hollow by order of the Archbishop. He never returned. Only fragments of his diary were found later, washed ashore along the Danube. His final entry was written in a shaking hand. The walls breathe, the ground listens, and in the silence I have heard it. The hollow is not absence, it is hunger. What the Silent Brothers guarded was not knowledge, it was infection, and to speak it aloud was to invite it in. This, my brother, is why silence was their creed. Because once the words are spoken, there is no taking them back. Silence was never passive for the brothers of Black Hollow. It was not peace, nor humility, nor devotion. Silence was dominance. Imagine being initiated, taken as a young man into the monastery, your tongue pricked with a needle, your mouth bound with the first stitches. From that moment on, every word you longed to speak, every confession you ached to release, was swallowed back into yourself. The order taught that sound was surrender, that those who spoke gave away fragments of their soul with every word. Only in silence, they said, does a man keep his power. But silence is not empty. It consumes. A recruit would spend weeks in isolation, locked in a cell with no light, listening only to the sound of his own pulse. No scripture, no chants, only breathing. The purpose was simple: to erode identity, to force the man to hear what the rest of the world spends its life drowning out. After weeks, some broke, screaming until their throats shredded, clawing their way out, begging to be released. These men were never seen again. Those who endured, however, emerged different. They became something colder, something detached. The silence no longer suffocated them, it shaped them. The brothers believed words created chains, that kingdoms, laws, and faiths were nothing but webs spun from sound. Destroy the web, destroy the illusion. Their silence was rebellion against every throne, every pulpit, every institution that demanded allegiance through spoken vows. And yet, ironically, the order itself was a cage. The brotherhood thrived on control, on stripping men of will and remaking them as vessels. They cut recruits off from their families. They stripped them of names. Each brother was known only by a number carved into the stone wall of his chamber. To erase the self was to become pure, they claimed, but in truth, it was to become an instrument. One chilling account describes a rite, all called the hollowing. A brother who faltered, who tried to speak or whispered in secret, would be bound in chains and lowered into the bone pit beneath the monastery. The others would stand above listening as the man screamed. The screams would echo, distort, and then fade. When the chains were raised, the brother was gone. No body, no trace, only silence. And here is where the power turns inward. Because silence is not merely absence, it becomes presence. Once you sit in it long enough, you begin to hear something else, something waiting. The brothers swore their silence was not a void, it was a conduit. They believed the hollow was not absence, but a voice so ancient, so immense, it could not be carried by human tongues. To speak it was to fracture the mind. To hear it required silence so absolute that the self dissolved. In the pit, in the stillness, initiates claimed to feel vibrations ripple through their bones like a drumbeat rising from beneath the world. These were not hallucinations. They were consistent, shared, repeated across centuries. And when the vibrations deepened, words would form, not words as we know them, but impressions, images that seared themselves into the mind. A forest burning without flame, a sun rising black against the sky, a great hand lowering itself into the earth, carving the first wound of hollow. To the untrained, these visions were terror. To the brothers, they were revelation. They believed the hollow was older than any god, any faith, older even than the soil, a wound carved at the birth of time. And from this wound, a presence seeped, a presence that offered power to those who dared to listen without flinching. One testimony, hidden in the margins of a confiscated manuscript, tells of a novice who endured 3 nights in the silence. When he emerged, he was pale, trembling, and blind in one eye. He could not speak, but he didn't need to. With only a stare, he silenced an entire hall of men. The chronicler writes, "It was not rage nor threat. It was as though the hollow looked out through him, and none of us dared to move." You see, the brotherhood did not need armies. They did not need swords. Their weapon was psychological dominion. By embodying silence, they forced others to confront what most men fear above death: stillness. They stripped the noise away, and in that void, people broke. This is why the church feared them, not because they denied God, but because they discovered a form of control that could unmake kingdoms. Silence could bend a man more than sermons or swords. It could force him to see himself, raw and defenseless, in the mirror of the hollow. and once a man gazed into that wound, he was never the same. The brothers had found a force that did not shout, did not strike, did not demand. It whispered through absence, and the deeper they listened, the more they believed they were no longer serving the Hollow, but becoming it. History would have you believe the silent brothers of Black Hollow were confined to a single monastery, an isolated sect of fanatics, extinguished in obscurity. But that is a lie crafted for your comfort. The order was not contained. Their silence bled outward, seeping into the veins of Europe like smoke in the rafters of a burning hall. How? Through influence, quiet men, strategically placed. A brother, stripped of his tongue, would be sent into the service of a noble house, not as priest or scholar, but as servant, advisor, or shadow. He would never speak, yet his presence would haunt the corridors of power. And soon decisions shifted. Kings grew hesitant to declare wars. Bishops faltered in their sermons. Judges overturned rulings as if guided by invisible hands. There are patterns in history that make no sense until you trace the outline of the Hollow. Why did an entire council in Vienna collapse without a single recorded argument? Why did a Polish duke renounce his throne after a year of silence, vanishing into a monastery never named? Why did a papal edict against unnatural vows of silence appear in 1720, just 8 years after the brothers were first whispered about? These were not coincidences, they were incursions. The brotherhood was never about monasteries, it was about infiltration. Silence as contagion. Place one brother in a court, in a council, in a pulpit, and suddenly conversations froze. Fear spread, choices bent. Men began to hear their own words differently, as if judged by something greater than themselves. This is the essence of psychological control, not to shout orders, not to brandish swords, but to bend men with nothing, to make them doubt their speech, their motives, even their identities. The Hollow was not merely in their pit, it was in every silence between words. A fragment of correspondence, intercepted between two cardinals in Romy. He hints at the truth. There are brothers among us. They do not speak, and yet they command. I fear it is not the devil we face, but the absence of God himself. That letter was burned, the author condemned, the traces scrubbed, but fragments survive, enough to see the pattern, enough to know the silent brothers were not destroyed, they were distributed, like seeds scattered in soil waiting to bloom. And perhaps they never stopped blooming. The rituals of the silent brothers were not merely private acts of devotion, they were weapons, tools to bind, to weaken, to control. Kings who believed themselves invincible, bishops armored in scripture, generals armored in steel, all were reduced when confronted by the brotherhood's ceremonies. The process was deceptively simple. First, silence. A hall, emptied of sound, thick with expectation. No chants, no hymns, only the deafening absence of voice. Then, a symbol, drawn in ash upon the ground, a hollow circle with its single dividing line. Rulers invited or coerced into these rituals were seated within the circle. Their guards refused entry, their attendants left behind. Only the brothers remained, their faces shadowed by hoods, mouths stitched or sealed with wax. The ritual had no words, no explanations, just the stare of silent men, unblinking, unyielding. At first nobles raged, shouted, demanded. But rage cannot thrive when it is swallowed whole by silence. The echoes of their own voices collapsed back on them, their authority shrank, and slowly, inevitably, the silence began to eat at them. Witnesses described moments where rulers broke, falling to their knees, trembling, begging forgiveness, though no accusation was spoken. Others wept uncontrollably, their wills shattered, confessing secrets they had sworn never to reveal. The silence exposed them, hollowed them, until they could no longer cling to their crowns or their convictions. The brothers called this ritual the unburdening. Its purpose was not merely humiliation, it was transformation. Once a ruler had been broken by silence, he was marked forever. He could not return to the same throne, the same decisions, without remembering the weight of that quiet. The Hollow had entered him, and from then on, every choice carried its shadow. Some rulers embraced it, seeing in silence a strength greater than army. Some others resisted, only to find their courts rotting from within, their advisors turned against them, their power dissolving like wax before flame. This is how empires bend, not by invasion but by infiltration of the mind. The Silent Brothers discovered the most profound form of domination, to force men to hear the one sound they cannot bear, themselves. And here lies the terror that institutions tried to erase. Silence was contagious. A king infected by the hollow would infect his council would infect their families. Entire courts fell into strange quiet, their laughter dead, their music muted, their halls echoing with absence. The Brotherhood did not simply break rulers, they rewrote them. Every force that dominates eventually breeds its rebellion. Even silence, especially silence. By the mid-1700s, whispers of the Silent Brothers' reach had spread beyond Europe's castles and cathedrals. Merchants carried rumors along trade routes. Sailors muttered of nobles who returned from council chambers with hollow eyes. Peasants spoke of lords who no longer laughed, who no longer cursed, who no longer spoke above a whisper. Something was spreading, they said, a stillness more terrifying than plague. And then came the defectors. Not every recruit could endure the hollow. Some were broken but not remade. These men, stripped of tongues, mutilated by vows, stumbled back into villages, writing their horrors on scraps of parchment, carving warnings into wood and stone. They were known as the fractured, survivors who had tasted the silence but resisted its grip. Their bodies carried the marks of the order, the black scars at the corners of the mouth, the deep grooves in the flesh where stitches had once sealed them. But their eyes burned with hatred. The fractured began to gather in secret, forming a counter-order. They carried blades etched with protective sigils, charms stolen from pagan traditions, and symbols inverted to defy the hollow's mark. Unlike the brothers, they embraced sound, drums, chants, guttural cries, anything to pierce the suffocating silence. To them, noise was survival. In 1743 they struck. Under the cover of a thunderstorm, a band of fractured stormed Black Hollow itself. The monastery's walls, already cracked with age, shook with the sound of war cries as torches blazed against the night. For the first time in its history, silence was broken inside those stone halls. Accounts diverge here. Some say the brothers stood motionless, accepting death with stitched mouths unbroken. Others insist the silence fought back. Echoes rising from the pit, lapsing lungs, shattering sanity. Whatever the truth, the monastery burned. Flames devoured its timbers, stones split in the heat, and the forest for miles glowed with an unholy light. But here is the paradox. Destruction did not end the order. Fire cannot burn silence. The monastery fell, yes, but the brothers did not. Many had already left, seeded across Europe. The flames consumed only stone. The silence lived on, carried in those who had already been hollowed. The rebellion succeeded in spectacle, but failed in essence. For silence is not slain with noise. It endures, it waits, and those who tried to resist it often found that the hollow followed them, whispering louder once they thought themselves free. The flames of Black Hollow's destruction lit the sky, but they did not extinguish the order. They scattered it. Like embers carried by the wind, the Silent Brothers drifted into new structures, cloaked not in robes but in suits, guilds, and secret lodges. The mid-1700s was an age of upheaval. Monarchies trembled, revolutions brewed, and beneath it all, the Enlightenment whispered promises of reason and progress. But behind the rhetoric of light lurked a darker inheritance, the hollow. Because while men were told they were awakening to freedom, another current was pulling them deeper into control. The Silent Brothers were there, unseen, unspoken, their silence threaded through the very societies that claimed to liberate mankind. Take the Freemasons, a brotherhood sworn to secrecy, bound by ritual, marked with symbols few understood. Their halls echoed with oaths of silence, gestures of control, and architecture designed to disorient the initiate. Were all Masons Silent Brothers? Of course not. But the hollow does not need armies, it only needs a few. In every lodge, a stitched mouth hidden among them, guiding meetings with his silence alone. Consider also the salons of Paris, where philosophers declared that words could reshape empires. Yet among them sat men who never spoke, who simply listened, eyes piercing, reminding all present that words were fragile, transient, powerless. It was a quiet corrosion, turning speech itself into a burden, making men doubt the very tools they thought would set them free. Even revolutions bore their mark. In 1789, during the storming of the Bastille, a banner was briefly raised before being torn down, an emblem resembling a hollow circle with a single line. Official histories deny it, but sketches survive, drawn hastily by witnesses, etched into pamphlets smuggled across borders. The hollow sign stood amidst the flames of Libas, Parti. This is the great deception. The Silent Brothers did not oppose enlightenment, they weaponized it. Where revolutions promised men new voices, the hollow reminded them that voices fail. Where republics claimed to free men from kings, the hollow bound them with doubt. Their silence was not against progress, it was beneath it, feeding on it, ensuring that every awakening was just another layer of the hollow's control. And so, as Europe sang of freedom, the Silent Brothers thrived. Not as monks in crumbling monasteries, but as advisors, financiers, keepers of the new order. Their silence was woven into the very foundations of modernity. The monastery burned, but the world became their monastery. By the late 1700s, the Silent Brothers had perfected something far greater than ritual or infiltration. They had found a way to encode silence into the very structures of civilization. No longer did they need monasteries, torches, or stitched mouths. Their methods became invisible, woven into education, law, and governance, systems that survive to this day. Think first of education. Schools, once places of apprenticeships and skills, were reshaped into silent halls of obedience, rows of children forced to sit in stillness, punished for speaking out of turn. The purpose was never knowledge. It was discipline, to condition generations into silence, into submission, into listening without question. The chalkboard replaced the altar, the teacher the priest, but the structure was the same. Speak when told, repeat what is given, never break the silence. Then, law. Courtrooms became theaters of silence. The accused is silenced, bound by procedure. The gallery hushed under threat of contempt. Only the voices of power are allowed, while the people watch in mute submission. The ritual is clear. Silence equals obedience, and obedience equals order. Governance followed the same principle. Parliaments and congresses gave the illusion of noise, men shouting, debating, but beneath it lies an iron silence. Decisions already made in the corridors of the hollow. What you witness is theater. The true work happens where no sound reaches you. Closed doors, sealed rooms, silence binding the air so tightly that even the most defiant voices eventually collapse into compliance. This was the genius of the Silent Brothers, to take their creed and make it structural, no longer a vow sworn in cloisters, but a condition of society itself. You live inside their monastery. You obey their silence every day. When you swallow words at work to keep your position, when you lower your voice in the presence of authority, when you sit in a classroom and recite what is demanded rather than what you know to be true, you are already practicing the hollow's discipline. And here is the most sinister part. Silence becomes self-policing. You don't need a brother watching you anymore. You become your own brother. You stitch your own mouth shut out of fear of consequence, rejection, punishment. The hollow doesn't even need to whisper. It has planted its silence inside you. The brotherhood no longer hides in monasteries. It hides in you. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Silent Brothers no longer resembled a secret order at all. They had dissolved into the bloodstream of empire, commerce, and science. But their creed, silence as power, silence as control, remained intact. It simply took on new disguises. Empires learned it first. Colonial powers discovered that silence was more effective than chains. You silence a people by erasing their tongue, replacing their words with the conquerors. Children beaten in schools for speaking native languages. Traditions outlawed, stories forbidden, songs banned. Entire cultures were stitched shut, their mouths bound in invisible thread. Empires expanded not just through guns and ships, but through the Hollow's principle, the domination of silence. Corporations followed. The industrial age demanded obedience, discipline, stillness. Factories lined with men reduced to silent cogs, forbidden to question, timed to the second, broken by the monotony of enforced quiet. Speak out, and you were dismissed. Complain, and you were crushed. The silence of industry was the silence of the brotherhood disguised as progress. And then came science, supposedly the great liberator of truth. But even here the Hollow embedded itself. Knowledge was no longer shared freely. It was gated, siloed, stamped with seals and institutions. Only the initiated could speak. Dissenting voices were silenced, branded heretics of reason. Universities became temples of quiet compliance, where students learned not to question too deeply, but to repeat the sanctioned truths. Science was molded into another monastery of silence, its walls fortified not by faith, but by prestige. This is how the Brotherhood adapted. They no longer needed stitched mouths or bone pits. Their silence was systemic, institutional, global. And here lies the darkest revelation. You were born into their silence. You have never known life outside of it. Every school you entered, every job you held, every court you obeyed, every truth you swallowed without question, it was all the Hollow's inheritance. Do not mistake this for paranoia. Look closely, and you will see it everywhere. The rules that forbid you to speak. The policies that crush your voice. The unspoken fear that coils in your throat every time you consider saying what you truly believe. You tell yourself it is survival, but survival is just another word for silence. And so unknowingly, generation after generation has been hollowed. The Brotherhood is no longer in cloisters or castles. It is in governments. It is in corporations. It is in classrooms. It is in you. Silence does not remain outside of you. It burrows inward. Once society teaches you to hold your tongue, to suppress your instincts, to filter every thought before it escapes your lips, the Hollow takes root in the most private chamber of all, your mind. Think of your childhood, the moments you wanted to speak, to question, to shout, but were silenced. Don't talk back. Stay quiet. Be polite. With every command, a stitch was tied across your mouth, small at first, but cumulative. By the time you reached manhood, your tongue was already bound. You were already a brother. This is the true genius of the Silent Order. They understood something psychology only later discovered. When you silence a man long enough, he begins to silence himself. The voice inside his skull becomes fractured. Doubt becomes his overseer. He second-guesses every decision, every desire, every act of rebellion. He no longer needs to be controlled, because he has become his own jailer. And what does that do to a man? It hollows him, strips him of fire. He moves through life muted, cautious, domesticated. He is no longer a force, he is a shadow. A man who might have spoken truth, led revolts, broken chains, now walks quietly to his deathbed, never once unleashing the words that burned inside him. This is not theory. It is observable everywhere. Men afraid to confront their superiors, husbands who swallow their anguish, workers who choke on injustices. The silence has shaped them into ghosts of themselves. They call it maturity, responsibility, pragmatism. But strip away the excuses, and you see it for what it is. Indoctrination. The Hollow remade them in its image. And yet, silence is seductive. It feels safe. To stay quiet is to avoid punishment. To nod along is to avoid conflict. But safety is not freedom. It is submission. And every time you bite your tongue, every time you bury your truth, you sink deeper into the pit the Silent Brothers opened centuries ago. That is why the Hollow survives, not because the brothers guard it with rituals, but because men carry it within themselves, guarding it more faithfully than any monastery could. The question you must now face is this: how much of your life has been lived by your own voice, and how much has been dictated by silence you didn't choose? The silent brothers of Black Hollow believed that truth was not spoken, but carved. That's why they carried knives, not as weapons of war, but as instruments of language. When one brother wanted to communicate with another, he would cut lines into wooden boards, into stone, even into his own skin. Each mark had meaning. Each scar was a sentence. Some men had their entire bodies turned into living manuscripts of pain and knowledge. Imagine a man's chest so covered in scars that it looked like parchment, his back a diary, his arms a library. And yet no outsider could read the script. Only those who had undergone the initiation could understand the silent grammar of their flesh. What does that mean for you listening now? It means that truth is never given freely. It is earned in blood. It is locked away not in books, not in archives, but in the living body itself. Think about that. The elites of your world still practice this, though with cleaner tools. Tattoos in plain sight that mean nothing to the uninitiated but everything to those inside. Corporate logos that look harmless but conceal geometric symbols of allegiance. Even the brands on consumer products, lines, circles, arcs, silent languages that tell insiders how to move the pieces of society like a game board. The brothers bled to write. You bleed without knowing why. Your sweat, your labor, your struggle. It's all translated by others into wealth, power, and silence. They write their language on you every day, and you don't even see it. The clothes you wear, the contracts you sign, the advertisements you obey. All of them scars on your identity. And while you think you're free, you've become a walking manuscript of their order. This is why the brothers of Black Hollow vanished from history books, because they reveal the template. If a secret order can encode its power in scars, then entire civilizations can encode theirs in you. And that, my friend, is exactly what has been done. They turned flesh into archive because paper could be burned. When the monastery learned that words could be stolen, they began to write on bone's slow, stubborn permanence. But paper was still too noisy, too easy for the world to read, so they moved inward. The body became the final library. Initiates learned to read scars as others read scripture. A cut meant a name, a knot of thread meant an oath, a pattern of punctures meant dates, debts, betrayals. You think tattoos are vanity or fashion. To them, tattoos were ledger lines, contracts inked into skin that bound a man without witnesses. Imagine a culture where a handshake is meaningless, but the scratch across a wrist is enforceable as law. Imagine courts that do not listen to testimony but read the margins of flesh and pass judgment. The brothers taught that memory left the world and nested in bodies, so the only way to protect the most dangerous knowledge was to make it intimate, invasive, and irreversible. And they devised rituals to seal that knowledge, a night of binding where a man's name was erased letter by letter with a knife, a morning of marking when a debt to the hollow was scored into the palm, a year of pilgrimage spent learning to speak in scars rather than syllables. The effect was brutal and total. Even if a brother tried to flee, his body announced his allegiance with every step. His skin betrayed him before his mouth could. But the method also had another advantage. It created witnesses that could not lie. The scars never blinked. They did not grow fearful or tired. They did not perjure themselves for coin. When an initiate tried to recant, the brotherhood would point to his own body and say, "See, your truth is written. You do not deny what your skin remembers." It was psychological engineering at its most intimate. The mind, trained to trust the body's markings, became easier to control, because its evidence could not be erased by rhetoric. And so the hollow perfected a tyranny that required no torturer's cry. It required only a surgeon's steady hand and a culture taught to read sensation as statute. What you call fashion, or heritage, or allegiance, what you accept as normal, were once the secret alphabet of an order that turned men into books, men whose pages could not be burned, men whose margins served as prisons. Listen to this. When you see a mark, a logo, a symbol, ask whose hand wrote it into you, because somewhere in history, an order learned that the most permanent control is the one that lives beneath your skin, and once it is there, your silence becomes proof. The rituals of silence deepened beyond scars. The silent brothers knew that pain was not just a wound. It was a teacher, a sculptor of obedience. They discovered something you were never meant to know. Pain has a language. Each type of suffering bends the mind in a different direction. Starvation does not teach the same lesson as isolation. A lash across the back writes a different truth than a nail pressed under a fingernail. They mapped this language of agony like cartographers of the human spirit. They could induce loyalty with one kind of pain, submission with another, and ecstatic revelation with yet another. And so their silence was not only an oath, it was the result of calibration. Imagine a novice locked in a stone cell, no sound, no light, no food for days. When he was released, he was unable to speak, not because he forgot language, but because silence had been grafted into him like marrow. His words had been replaced with a discipline of absence. His silence was proof he had been remade. The brothers extended this practice to whole villages under their control. At night they would descend, hooded and faceless, enforcing quiet by decree. Children were taught to cry without sound, mothers to pray without voice, men to barter in gestures alone. A society ruled not by fear of death, but by fear of speaking, because once speech dies, rebellion dies with it. What is an uprising without words? What is freedom if it cannot be named aloud? And here lies the revelation they wanted hidden. Every institution you think protects you has learned this same lesson, not by whips and scars, but by distraction, by noise, by the removal of language itself. Your vocabulary is shrinking. Words of power, words like sovereignty, allegiance, virtue, are being erased and replaced with hollow substitutes. They are not banning your speech, no, they are making you forget the very words you would need to rise. The Silent Brothers of Black Hollow showed the template. Silence is not merely absence of sound, it is engineered absence of resistance. And the same silence echoes now, in schools, in media, in courts of law. You do not notice it, because silence never announces itself. It creeps, it smothers, until one day you wake up and realize you have nothing left to say, and nowhere left to say it. Silence as absence was only the beginning. The Silent Brothers learned to weaponize it, turning quiet into a force that could bend men to their knees without a single blow. Imagine standing in a chamber where dozens of hooded figures encircle you, none of them moving, none of them breathing loud enough to be heard. No cough, no shuffle, not even the faintest sound of fabric. The silence becomes unbearable, crushing, like a weight pressing against your chest. Your heartbeat grows louder, your breath betrays you, and you realize you are the only noise in a world that has erased you. That awareness alone shatters men more brutally than chains. This was the Silent Brothers' genius. They understood that silence itself can scream. In rituals of judgment, they did not condemn with words. They stood around the accused and said nothing. The longer the silence stretched, the more the victim filled it with his own guilt, his own fears, his own desperate confessions. They didn't have to punish. The man punished himself, begging for relief, begging for words, even words of condemnation, just to end the void. You've experienced this on smaller scales. A room of people falls silent when you enter, and suddenly you feel exposed, judged, diminished. Or when someone you love withdraws into silence, and it cuts deeper than their anger ever could. Silence can be louder than any voice. The brothers perfected this, wielding it like a blade sharper than steel. And here is the truth you must face. Modern institutions use the same weapon. They silence truths not by refuting them, but by ignoring them. They silence dissent not by answering it, but by letting it vanish in a digital void, making you question whether you ever spoke at all. They silence men by drowning them in meaningless noise until the only thing left is emptiness. This is silence at scale. This is silence as power. The brothers of Black Hollow discovered the psychology first, that a man surrounded by silence begins to question not the world, but himself. And once a man doubts his own voice, he can be controlled by any hand that offers him sound. Tell me, are you starting to hear the silence around you now? The brothers did not stop at bending men with silence. They went further, using it to erase who a man was. In Black Hollow, identity was not considered sacred. It was clay to be broken and remolded, and silence was the chisel. Picture this. An initiate was stripped of his name on the night he entered the order. Not just denied from speaking it, no, every brother around him would refuse to acknowledge it, as though the syllables themselves never existed. Days passed, then weeks, until even the sound of his own name in his head began to wither. When at last he whispered it in the dark, desperate to hear it, the sound was alien, hollow, useless. He had become nameless, and namelessness was their weapon. But they did not leave him empty. Once the silence devoured his identity, they gave him a new one, written not in words but in scars, gestures, and silence itself. He ceased to be a man and became an instrument, a vessel for the Brotherhood's will. You see, silence was not just absence of sound, it was the dissolution of self. Think about the world you live in now. They erase you not by burning your records or silencing your voice, but by drowning you in noise until nothing about you matters. The labels they hand you, consumer, worker, voter, statistic, replace the one thing that was truly yours, your name, your true self. And once you accept those empty designations, your own voice becomes irrelevant. You've been rewritten, just like the brothers rewrote their initiates. This was their dark brilliance. They discovered that silence could unmake a man without spilling blood, to strip him of everything he thought he was until he begged for any identity, even one forged by his captors. That hunger for belonging, that thirst to be seen again, was the final chain. You may think this is distant, long forgotten, but tell me, when was the last time you felt your name had weight? When was the last time it stood for something beyond papers, beyond databases, beyond numbers tied to debts and systems? The silent brothers of Black Hollow are gone, but their technique remains alive, buried in the world around you, and the silence they engineered still works, subtle, invisible, corrosive. The deeper you descend into Black Hollow, the less it feels like a monastery, and the more it feels like a tomb. The walls sweat with damp, the air grows heavy, and every step is swallowed by a silence so total it presses against your skull. It was here, in the deepest chamber, that the silent brothers revealed their final secret. Silence was not just a tool, it was a doorway. They believed that beneath all sound lies a greater presence, something ancient and waiting. Noise, they said, is the distraction of the living. But silence, that abyss, was the true language of the dead, and in that black hush they communed with something no man was meant to touch. Witnesses spoke of rituals where brothers sat unmoving for days, faces veiled, lips sealed, no food, no water. Their bodies grew weak, but their minds were said to open like a gate. Some returned from this vigil of absence hollow-eyed, forever changed. Others never returned at all, their bodies found lifeless, seated upright, as if whatever they had invited had claimed them completely. Here is the part most feared by the church, by the crown, by every institution that sought to bury the brotherhood. The silent brothers claimed their stillness allowed them to hear what they called the Great Quiet. Not the absence of sound, but an intelligence inside the silence itself. An entity that whispered without words. An order older than kingdoms, older than the church, older even than history itself. They listened, and they obeyed. And this is where myth blurs with horror. For in records smuggled out by spies, it was said that the brothers began to predict disasters before they came. Plagues, wars, storms. They heard the silence echo long before the world screamed. Some claimed they didn't just listen but conspired with it, shaping the course of kingdoms by aligning themselves with what they called the silence beneath creation. Do you see the danger here? If silence can be more than absence, if it can be inhabited, then every quiet moment around you might not be empty. It may be occupied. It may be watching. The brothers of Black Hollow vanished, but the silence they opened still lingers, and men still kneel to it whether they know it or not. The silence did not die with the brothers. It evolved. Those who erased the order from history did not destroy their knowledge. They absorbed it. Monarchs, inquisitors, bankers, even the architects of your modern world, each stole fragments of the Brotherhood's craft, polishing it into something more subtle, more pervasive. You see it everywhere, though you've trained yourself not to. Silence has become the engine of power, not the silence of monasteries or libraries, but institutional silence, the silence of redacted documents, the silence of classified files sealed for 100 years, the silence of politicians smiling while saying nothing, while the truth hangs unspoken in the room like a loaded gun. Governments silence whistleblowers, corporations silence dissent, algorithms silence speech, not by forbidding it, but by making it vanish into the digital void. That is the modern black hollow, the void that eats words and buries voices in invisible graves. And here is the darkest truth. Silence is not only censorship, it is complicity. When disasters strike, when corruption is exposed, when crimes against humanity unfold in plain sight, what do you hear from the powerful? Silence. That silence is not ignorance, it is strategy. Because while you wait for answers, while you rage against the quiet, they are already rewriting the script. Think of it, entire wars launched without explanation, fortunes transferred without record, decisions that reshape your life made in sealed rooms, minutes lost to history. Silence is their shield and their sword, and while you're taught to fear noise, bombs, riots, chaos, the real power has always been in what is withheld. The silent brothers of Black Hollow practiced it in stone chambers by candlelight. Today, their inheritors practice it in boardrooms, in courts, in secure networks. The methods are different. The principle is the same. Seize, control the silence, and you control perception. Control perception, and you control reality. And here is where you must wake up. Silence is not neutral. It is curated. It is designed. It is the chosen tool of those who know that the loudest lies can be defeated, but silence has no opponent. Silence makes you fight shadows, argue with ghosts, drown in questions that will never be answered. This is why you feel powerless, because the silence that rules you is not absence, it is architecture. The silent brothers taught that the most effective prison is one the prisoner builds himself. In Black Hollow they observed a simple truth: men will guard their own cages if you teach them to believe the bars are invisible. Look inward. How many compromises have you accepted because speaking seemed costlier than staying silent? How many small betrayals, of honesty, of courage, of loyalty, have you rationalized away in private conversations with yourself? They called this sanctifying absence. Psychology calls it internalization. You rehearse reasons to be quiet until they sound like virtue. You tell yourself you are reasonable, mature, pragmatic. In truth, it is capitulation wearing a robe. The mind learns to prefer the safety of nullity over the chaos of truth. Once trained, you defend the system that taught it to you because it trades comfort for the sacrifice of your voice. This internal prison is stitched with rituals, the polite nod that terminates dissent, the laugh that muffles a protest, the script you follow in meetings that allows no deviation. Each ritual tightens the net, each omission compounds until you cannot imagine life outside it. You begin to police not only your speech but what you deem worth saying. The Hollow turns debate into theater and conviction into performance. Men act as if they speak, but their silence does the ruling. Breaking this requires brutal honesty. Name the moments you chose silence and admit the cost, not to wallow in guilt, but to reclaim the currency of your voice. Begin small, refuse a falsehood at work, tell an honest thing to a friend, let an anger be spoken until it loses its poison. Each word is both wound and cure. Each time you pick voice over silence, you shrink the Hollow's reach a little more. Remember, silence passes down. A father who never names what matters teaches a son to swallow. If you reclaim your name, you reclaim a line. Say what your father would not. Say what your son must not inherit. If you are listening and you understand, write this phrase in the comments twice. I unbind my name. Write it twice. Say it, then write it. The first time you address yourself, the second time you declare it publicly. This is not theater, it is commitment. Do it now. Feel the stitch loosen. Repeat it twice. Repeat it until it rings true. Now speak. The moment a man writes, I unbind my name, he severs the first thread. But understand, threads are not chains, they are webs. and webs cling. The silent brothers of Black Hollow knew that breaking silence was not a single act. It was war, because once you spoke against the void fought back. They trained their initiates for this. When a man dared to reclaim his voice, they did not congratulate him. They crushed him with silence heavier than before. Days of being ignored, nights of hearing nothing but his own pulse. The test was clear. If his new voice withered under pressure, then it was false. If it grew stronger, then he had been reborn. This is the hidden pattern in your world now. Try speaking against the official narrative, and what do you face? Not debate, not argument, not open confrontation. You face silence. No answer, no acknowledgement. Just the quiet weight that makes you wonder if you even exist. That is not accident, that is strategy. And it was perfected long ago, in stone chambers deep beneath Black Hollow. The brothers called this the trial of the echo. A man speaks into silence, and if no echo returns, he must choose. Does he fall quiet again, or does he keep speaking into the void until his voice itself becomes the echo? Few could survive it, but those who did became something else, men whose words carried the weight of scars, men who could not be ignored. You must see what this means. Every silence you endure is not emptiness. It is a test. It asks, will you retreat or will you amplify? The world trains you to retreat, to shrug and say, it doesn't matter, to swallow words that might have cracked the mask. But the Brotherhood's forbidden lesson is this: only the man who insists on voice against silence becomes unbreakable. This is why their enemies feared them, not because they were silent, but because those who passed the trial of the echo became immune to silence itself. Imagine the terror of rulers facing men who could not be erased, men who kept speaking even when no one answered. And that, brother, is what you must become. The final transformation was not silence nor speech, it was fusion. The silent brothers learned that voice and silence could be wielded together like two blades in the same hand. When they reached this mastery, they became more than monks, more than men. They became instruments of fear. Here's how it worked. A brother would stand in a hall filled with villagers, cloaked and faceless. He would not move. He would not speak. Hours could pass. The silence alone gnawed at the crowd until someone broke, blurting a confession, revealing a secret, or begging for mercy no one had demanded. The brother would then speak, but only one sentence, just one. And because it was the first sound after endless silence, the words landed like thunder. That single phrase could turn men against each other, drive a wife to doubt her husband, make an entire village obey without resistance. This was their greatest weapon, scarcity. In a world saturated with noise, words are cheap. In a chamber ruled by silence, words become priceless. The Brotherhood discovered that speech has power only when silence has prepared the ground. They engineered obedience not with force, but with anticipation. They understood what modern rulers now practice: control the silence, and you control the value of sound. Think about your world today. Politicians speak endlessly and yet say nothing. Their noise numbs you. But when a powerful institution withholds words, when they remain silent on the one truth that matters, that silence terrifies, it creates pressure, hunger, desperation. And then when they finally speak, you cling to every syllable as if it were revelation. This is no accident. It is orchestration. The Silent Brothers wrote the first script. The elites of today perfected the play. What is more dangerous, a lie, or the silence that makes you beg for a lie just to fill the void? That was their lesson. That is the curse they left the world. In Black Hollow, the brothers used this fusion to remake men, villages, even kings. And in the process, they carved a truth you must not forget. Silence and speech are not opposites. They are accomplices. Now tell me, are you beginning to see how often your life has been ruled not by what was said, but by what was withheld? The Black Hollow was only the seed. Its practices bled outward, hidden beneath cloaks of religion, politics, and law. When the Brotherhood was scattered, they did not vanish. They dispersed like embers, carried into the institutions that shape your life today. And in each, they planted the same method. Wield silence not as emptiness, but as power. The church was the first to take it. They saw how silence turned villagers into supplicants, and they built it into ritual. Think of the confessional box. A man whispers, but the priest remains silent. That silence forces the man to reveal more, to unburden himself until the cage of his own guilt locks tight. The silence is not mercy, it is leverage. Then came the courts. The gavel falls, and silence commands the room. The accused is told, "You have the right to remain silent." Understand the inversion here. Silence is presented as protection, but in truth, it becomes a trap. Speak, and you may be condemned. Stay silent, and you brand yourself guilty in the eyes of the jury. The same double bind the Hollow perfected centuries earlier. And finally, the empires. Kings and rulers learned the spectacle of silence, a sovereign's pause before a decree, the days of delay before announcing war, the refusal to answer the people's cries. Each silence multiplied fear, speculation, obedience. The Hollow's technique scaled until entire nations bent under the weight of unanswered questions. Do not mistake this for coincidence. These are not cultural quirks, not harmless traditions. They are fragments of the Hollow, sharpened and institutionalized. Ritualized silence became the foundation of psychological rule. It taught subjects to doubt themselves, to mistrust their own voice, to crave words from above, even when those words were poison. And here you are, centuries later, still caught in the same web. You scroll, you search, you plead for suggestion or answers. And when none come, you sink into the same despair the villagers of Black Hollow felt under the cloaks of the brothers. The stage has changed. The actors have changed. But the script remains. Silence is not passive. It is engineered. It is the architecture of control that still holds empires together, even as you believe you are free. The funeral was scheduled for late November, when the air carried a sting sharp enough to remind men of their mortality. A small procession formed outside the church. Neighbors, merchants, curious strangers, drawn less by grief than by the sheer spectacle of a boy who had lived without a pulse, whose veins had carried silence where life should have been. Tobias Hale's coffin was polished black, the kind reserved for the wealthiest citizens, though he had never known wealth. The carpenter who made it confessed under hushed breath that the wood resisted his tools, as though the tree from which it had been cut had not wished to be shaped into a vessel for this particular corpse. Inside the church, the organ groaned, each note stretching long and uneven, as though the pipes themselves were reluctant to give voice to the proceedings. A portrait of Tobias, drawn hastily by a local artist, rested on the altar. The likeness was eerie. His eyes, though sketched in charcoal, seemed too alive, too knowing. Some refused to look at it directly. Others whispered that the artist had wept uncontrollably after completing the work, insisting that the boy's stare followed him home. When the coffin was carried inside, 4 men strained as though they bore a weight far greater than a child's small body. The pallbearers later admitted their hands had grown numb, not from the cold, but from an unnatural vibration traveling through the wood. Several times they nearly dropped it, convinced that something inside shifted on its own. The priest, Father Whitlock, a stern man not known for fear, lost his composure mid-sermon. His throat tightened when he attempted the line, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust." For the first time in 30 years, he stammered. He glanced at the coffin and faltered, his lips trembling as if the words themselves had turned to lead. A young girl in the front pew began to cry, claiming she heard whispers beneath the priest's voice, whispers not meant for the living. When it came time to close the ceremony, the church bell tolled 3 times. But on the 4th swing, the rope snapped. The clapper inside the bell struck the walls with such force that it cracked, sending dust down upon the congregation. The crowd gasped, many taking it as a sign that heaven itself had rejected the burial. Some wanted to flee, others wanted to stay and see if the impossible would happen. In that tense silence, the coffin lid creaked. Not fully, but enough that every man, woman and child swore they saw it shift against the nails meant to hold it fast. And in that moment, a question haunted all present. Was this truly a funeral, or merely an intermission? The burial took place the following morning, A bitter frost clung to the ground, and the cemetery soil had hardened into something closer to stone. Men with shovels labored for hours to dig a hole deep enough to house the coffin. Each strike of metal against earth rang like a bell, and yet progress was strangely slow, as if the ground resisted being torn open. One gravedigger swore he saw steam rising from the soil, though the air was freezing cold. Another refused to continue after his shovel bent, not against rock, but against something soft, something that yielded yet would not let go. By noon the grave was ready, though its walls seemed to pulse faintly, like the inside of a living thing. The coffin was lowered on ropes, each man grunting with exertion as though they were dragging the dead downward against his will. The ropes trembled, fibers fraying, until the coffin touched bottom with a sound too loud for wood against dirt, more like a hollow drum echoing across an empty hall. The priest began his final prayer, but his voice broke when he reached the line about eternal rest. "Rest," he said once. Then again, softer, as though the word itself were being swallowed from his throat. Witnesses later claimed they heard a second voice echoing his words, deeper and older, rising from the grave. When the first shovelful of earth was tossed onto the coffin, the dirt refused to scatter naturally. It clumped together, heavy, almost wet, and rolled off the lid as though repelled. The grave diggers exchanged glances, muttering about bad omens, but continued. Soon, however, the soil itself grew uncooperative, falling in slow, strange patterns, each handful seeming to be drawn back into the shovel instead of covering the coffin. Then came the sound, an unmistakable knock 3 times from inside the box. The crowd gasped, and several women fainted. Men tried to explain it away, here's wood settling, but the rhythm was too deliberate. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more, then silence. A code that no one dared to answer. Panic set in. Families pulled their children away. The priest attempted to calm the crowd, but his own hands shook so violently that his Bible slipped from his grasp, landing spine first into the dirt. Its pages opened randomly, and those close enough to see swore the words on the parchment had rearranged themselves into something unholy. The grave was finally filled, though hurriedly, and not with the usual solemnity. The mound of earth looked unfinished, uneven, as if the ground itself resented its burden. Some whispered that the soil rose and fell ever so slightly, as though breathing. By sundown the cemetery stood quiet, save for the cold wind through the trees, but every person who attended swore that night. When they tried to sleep, they heard the faint echo of those knocks, 3 at a time, resonating through their walls, their floors, their very bones. The first night after the burial, the town of Black Hollow did not sleep. Dogs howled without pause, their cries pitched not toward the horizon, but toward the cemetery. Chickens refused to roost, pacing in frenzied circles until their wings bled from frantic beating. Horses pulled against their reins until their mouths foamed white, eyes rolling wildly at some unseen figure pacing the periphery of the barns. By dawn, the people noticed other things. The frost that had blanketed the earth melted in a perfect circle around Tobias Hale's grave, though the rest of the cemetery remained locked in winter's grip. And worse, the mound itself had sunk slightly, as though something beneath it shifted restlessly. Inside homes, the disturbances multiplied. A farmer's wife awoke screaming because she swore she heard someone breathing beside her in bed, yet her husband was still outside, tending to the animals. Children complained of whispers threading through their dreams, voices urging them to follow the silence. Lamps flickered not with the sputter of low oil, but with an unnatural rhythm, pulsing 3 times before returning to steady light. The townspeople gathered in hushed groups, whispering about what they had seen and felt. The elders spoke of old warnings, of men who had been marked from birth, men not bound by ordinary death. The younger ones laughed nervously, yet their eyes betrayed terror, for even the laughter sounded hollow in Black Hollow now. That evening, a man named Samuel Brooks, the gravedigger who had heard the first knock, was found at the edge of the cemetery wall, pale as bone, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His fingernails were torn and bloody, as though he had tried to claw his way into the earth. Around his neck hung the priest's lost Bible, which no one remembered giving to him. Its pages were still open to the passage where the words had rearranged. And only now the letters appeared burned into the parchment, charred black, as though seared by invisible fire. And then came the most chilling sign of all. At midnight, a sound rang across the valley, a hollow, deliberate knocking. 3 strikes. Silence. 3 more. It carried through walls, across fields, into every heart that dared to listen. No one could tell if it came from the cemetery or from beneath their very floorboards. The silent brothers of Black Hollow, those who claimed descent from forbidden orders, leaned forward in the shadows of taverns and whispered, "It has begun.